the board accepts accountability for financial stability and long-term future of the school, what does this mean to you as a trustee? If you're not on the finance committee, does this mean that you don't have a role to play in the stewardship of the school's finances and resources? In this video, we explore the duties you have as a trustee, whether you're on the finance committee or not. While the finance committee is meant to provide the detailed oversight of the school's finances and resources, actually all trustees share accountability of the school's financial stability and long-term success. Since it's the whole board that approves the budget and takes into consideration any strategic initiatives, it's therefore important that all trustees have accurate insight into the financial position of the school and projected forecasts for the next 3 to 5 years. Trust schools also generally conduct an external audit of the accounts annually, which is reported to parents, although this may not be the same for proprietary schools. So when you think of the 3 duties, the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience, of course, a board's primary function is to hold the school in trust. And so your duty of care means that you have to take all appropriate steps to ensure that you're well informed about the current and projected position of the school and are making appropriate decisions as a result. Your duty of loyalty is to ensure the long-term interests of the school are the reason for decision, and to ensure that there's no conflict of interest in your deliberations. Actually, your fiduciary oversight responsibility includes the school's finances, but is not restricted to fiscal oversight, since you need to ensure that host country laws and regulations are also being followed. So what does that mean to you as a trustee? The Finance Committee generally reviews details of the school's accounts, which typically includes the profit and loss statement and the balance sheet. In basic terms, the balance sheet reports a summary of the school's assets and liabilities, whereas the profit and loss, or the P&L, summarizes the revenues and expenditure during a specific period. The balance sheet and the P&L tend to be generated by the accounts office as summaries of the transactions for the year to date. While these are valuable, especially to those with an eye for accounting, arguably more insightful is the budget versus spend financial performance. As a trustee, these 3 sets of figures gives you an understanding of how the school is performing. But remember that if you don't fully understand the figures, then under your duty of care, you should ask for further clarification from others on the board or the finance committee that may have more financial experience than you. Sometimes pages of Excel spreadsheets can bamboozle people, but there may be other graphical ways of representing the data, and particularly the financial implications. So for example, if there's an unexpected drop in enrollment of 50 children against the budgeted figures, what are the implications for this? Often a chart or graph can help non-accountants to understand the impact on staffing or budget cuts or reserves. Let's just come back to the budget versus actual spend figures for a moment, as there are some considerations that you may want to take into account. Again, the idea is that you're not trying to catch somebody out, but you are taking all prudent steps to avoid being given data that somehow isn't properly representational. Typically, the budget versus spend is given as a figure up to the end of the previous month. Same with the P&L and balance sheets. And you might like to check with the school's procedures handbook or ask the accounts staff for when the months are closed and the timeline then for reporting to the board. But these are really details for the accounts office, and certainly the finance committee would be involved in reviewing the policies and procedures for the financial management and reporting. The point is, however, that not all revenue and expenditure is linear. That is, the accounts are not always spread evenly each month, and this is particularly the case for international schools, which can be misleading if you're not careful and not really paying attention to what you're looking at. So take, for example, the income, which is through school fees. Of course, schools may approach invoicing differently, and some require terms fees in advance, while companies or embassies may pay, for example, the whole year. Maybe parents have individual payment plans that allow for monthly payments. So at the beginning of the year, the income statement reflects some payments for the whole year, some for the term, some for the month. And so you need to be clear about whether the figures presented are the cash received or whether they are sort of advance payments, if you like, treated as an accrual. Now take, for example, some of the expenses. salaries would be more or less equally distributed over a 12-month period. However, if you look at medical insurance, maybe this is paid in one lump sum annually, or maybe in 2 installments or quarterly. If you look at faculty budgets, they may look inactive for many, many months, depending on what local purchases may be required, but perhaps the school puts in a large overseas order each year, which then wipes out the budget in one fell swoop. So with this in mind, when reviewing the school's income and expenditure, it's helpful to know not just the budgeted amount, but where the spend is compared to the anticipated figures for that month. This takes a lot of time and work from the finance team and the head of school, but it's really important if you're to gain an accurate insight into the spending patterns. Equally, remember that this is often a bit of a best guess estimate, and it's not an exact science. So for example, utilities, you may be able to estimate month on month, but for other things, maybe the exact timing might differ, which could create some bottlenecks in the cash flow position, or the cash on hand, so to speak. So for example, if the school receives invoices for major overseas orders and medical insurance in August, this may correspond at a time when the cash reserves are very low because deposits and salaries have been paid, and yet payments for the new school fees, the New Year's fees, haven't yet been received. Since it's the responsibility of the board to set the budget and corresponding tuition rates, there are a few other factors that you should take into consideration. It's quite possible that the staffing costs account for around between 60 and 80% of the annual budget. While the practicalities of staff recruitment and retention are the responsibility of the head of school, it's the board's role to set appropriate rates of remuneration that sufficiently attract staff to work in the school and to retain them. Of course, it can be tricky to know how best to benchmark salaries and overall packages, and much depends on the type of school and where the staff come from. If you are trying to attract overseas staff, for example, then comparing salaries to salaries in local schools may be an irrelevant exercise. And while the salary shouldn't be the only motivator to work in the school, the level of remuneration would need to be sufficient to attract and to retain them. While some teachers may accept a lower salary in exchange for some overseas adventure, for example, maybe that leads to a bit of a backpacker mentality where the main reason to join you is because it's a stepping stone as a hub for travel opportunities rather than for a passion of making a difference in your school as a teacher. So as trustees, you need to factor in staffing costs plus associated costs, particularly for overseas hired staff that might include housing and flights and medical insurance. Other factors is the potential impact of fluctuations in exchange rates, for example. If the host country currency devalues, or if there's significant strengthening of the dollar or pound, how might this affect you in your budget projections? How much are you working in local currency versus dollars or pounds? And actually, this is an example of risk management, which again falls under the purview of the board. Trustees need to be aware of the potential risks that face the school, and particularly those that have financial implications. Remember the balance sheet that lists the assets and liabilities? This is part of the risk management too, making sure that you have sufficient reserves to cover the money that the school owes. But risk management goes beyond just the balance sheet, and I tend to remember this in my terms as a matrix based on what will it do. So the what is the process of identifying each area of risk through direct finance, such as changes in enrollment, accidents, legal cases, fraud, natural disasters, things like that. Having identified each aspect that may be at risk, you can then consider the will, or put it another way, will it happen? By assessing the probability of an event happening helps to frame the problem and potential strategies of dealing with it. The it then refers to the impact that the risk might have, which could be financial, but it could damage the school's reputation, negative publicity, legal action, poor morale, etc. And finally, the do refers to the action that you can take as a board to ameliorate the risk. This generally falls under the options of avoid, find ways of avoiding the risk by taking a different approach, controlling the situation so as to ensure there's no possibility of failure, train, invest in training staff appropriately, insure, making sure that you have appropriate levels of insurance to cover any claims, or accepting that there's a risk and it's sufficiently small compared to the gain that it's a worthwhile risk to take. So for example, let's say that your school's thinking about having a week without walls or a week of residential trips for all the secondary students. Do these trips to different parts of your country or even overseas, do they come without risks? Of course not. Trips can be cancelled. There can be civil war. Children can get sick. They can slip and break their arm, or any number of other risks. So the what process in the matrix identifies each potentially anticipated risk, along with the likelihood that it will happen. At a school level, the organisers would also go into more details about what strategies would be employed in each of the scenarios, and generally the trips would be discussed at length with the school leadership before being signed off. But as a board, where the accountability ultimately falls, it's your responsibility to ensure that the risks have been carefully considered by the leadership, and you would think in broad terms then about weighing the impact of the risks alongside the benefits of this new learning experience for the children through the trips. Unlikely perhaps, except in the case of a highly volatile area, but as a policy the board could say that the risks are not worth the benefit, and so as a way to avoid the risks, no trips can take place outside of the school. Alternatively, the board may want to insist that there are control mechanisms in place for each area of risk to minimize the danger or to ensure that all trip leaders have received specialist outward bound training. Maybe you wanted to check with the school's business manager that the school has sufficient insurance to cover accidents, whether in school or on trips. And ultimately, the board may have to accept that after all the controls and all of the training has been put in place, maybe there's a small chance still of an accident, but it's worth taking that risk in order for the students to gain from this educational experience of the week without walls. Finally, an area that you as a trustee do have significant impact is in determining policy. The Finance Committee themselves should review the policies and procedures that relate to finance and business management. But as a trustee, you can also ask questions to assure yourself that these important documents are sufficiently robust to protect the school and its assets. Even as a non-financial expert on the board, you can ask that there are certain measures put in place that give a quick and simple indication of the school's health. So for example, a simple one might be an overall student-to-teacher ratio. Maybe you've picked 10-1. And as long as it's clear how the teaching staff are defined, such as does it include members of the leadership or specialist teachers, then it gives a clearly identifiable measure for change. As enrolment drops and corresponding staffing ratio goes up, maybe to 8.5-1, this might trigger real discussions about the affordability of this model. Equally, you may want to set your financial reserves at a minimum threshold level, or say professional development budget at 2% of income. So when it comes to trimming budgets, you'd be very clear when a threshold point has been reached, and at that point, how you're going to deal with a situation. In reflecting now about the financial responsibilities of all trustees, what do you think you may need to follow up on? What further information might you need from the business manager or the head of school or the finance committee? What can you do to ensure that you have an overview of the school's finances with the aim of guaranteeing the long-term financial health of the school?